What is the thing that makes a good thing go bad? Does it come from other people and their opinions about you or things? Or does it come from events that you can't control? Or does it come from you? And if it does come from you, would you do something about it? Hi everyone, I'm Tammy Becker and I'm the founder of YOU Ministries, and today we are covering 1 Samuel. So as we get started in this topic, in the book of 1 Samuel, which features the first answer to choose Israel's first king. So in Samuel, like the previous books, 1 Samuel belongs to a series of books labeled history. And 1 Samuel is the fourth book in the 12 books that are considered history in the Bible. 9th overall in the Old Testament. And so, reviewing what we've covered before quickly, the main difference in the earlier 5 books, they were called the Torah, the law. And these next 12 books of the Bible are called the history books. So as we know, history is very important. It's what we learn from. The Torah books was Genesis to Deuteronomy, and they detailed the promise of salvation that God made to Abraham and his descendants in the long journey towards the promised land and the formation of their sacred commandments. Now, the books of history, however, start with the arrival of the people in the promised land and all the challenges to bring the promise of God's grace towards other nations that seek salvation outside of the tribe of Israel. It's debated again in the book of 1 Samuel. It is really unknown again who the author is, just like in Ruth and in Judges. It's mostly unknown. It's a mystery who wrote it, but scholars have their theories that it was probably written by people that were close to the ones who wrote the book of Deuteronomy. But that's only speculation, so don't quote me on it. That's just what the scholars say. So in the Bible study today, the name of 1 Samuel refers to the first half of the story and ends in 2 Samuel. It is a long story. It's going to be told in 2 parts, as we're going to do here. So I'm going to try to get through the review quickly, but give you enough content that you feel you got value out of the lesson. The reason there is 2 parts is because the whole story is long. So that it's broken into 2 important parts. Like the book of Ruth, for an example, was almost a standalone story. You know, you could get wrapped up in it emotionally and fall in love with Ruth and that whole story. And it's an intimate and beautiful short story about the faithfulness of God to those who have faith in Him, even in the smallest of things. But in 1 Samuel and 2 Samuel, it's not like that. 1 Samuel goes back to the societal and political events that came after the horrible time of Israel's judges. So in the first part of this book, it's going to talk about an answer to the need for a unified king for the people of Israel. The main people that we're going to discuss in 1 Samuel is in its title, of course, Samuel, but there's also other important people that we want to mention. So namely Samuel, then there was Hannah, that was his mother, and then Eli, which was the son of Samuel, Saul, and David, from David, the story of David and Goliath. So the general outline of the book of 1 Samuel kind of gets divided into roughly about 3 sections. So we're going to see a set of chapters about Samuel, and then we're going to see a set of chapters about Saul's role, and then another set of chapters about David's role. Now we're going to also see that there's lessons from all three sections that are really important about what happens later on in 2 Samuel. So we're going to get started in chapter 1, and it begins by telling of a story of a woman named Hannah. Now, Hannah was the mother, and she grieved about why she couldn't bear a child. And then we're going to see in chapter 2, however, that at some time, Hannah gave birth to a boy named Samuel. So she was full of joy, and she sang beautiful songs about God. She sang to God about opposing those who are proud and exalt those who are humble. And she was just ecstatic and gave all the glory and praise to God. Now, despite the evil that is in humans, God remains at work to raise a messianic king for the salvation of their people. Still, again, he's trying to take care of Israel. So the story of this promised redemption is there because Hannah's song took place after the events of the book of Judges. So Samuel, for example, grew up to be both prophet and judge. And then Samuel, after all, it means asked of God, because Hannah asked and she grieved for a child, and Samuel was given to her by God. And she gave all the praise to God for that. So this meant that Samuel was asked by his mother, and that he was a messenger. And he was going to be a messenger of God to the people of Israel, as had Moses and Joshua before him. So he also had the different problem of his role as a judge. So he had to be the judge. He would not only have to speak about God and become the ruler for the people, but the ruler here meant many battles against Israel's many enemies. So then we're going to skip to get into chapters 4 to 7, and we find an example where we find that the Philistines had grown great armies, and Israel was still at war with them. So the Israelites proclaimed God, and the Philistines proclaimed an idol god named Dagon. So we're going to insert our discoveries from the past right here. These battles had gone on long enough that the modern day researchers have found old cities with a temple in Ugarit, or Ras Shamrah, since the days of Saul and David. The researchers have even found artifacts that were made by the people of the time with the name Dagon written on them. That's fascinating. I love bringing you those. So in these chapters, we're going to find that the Israelites, proud of their achievements against the other groups, and even flaunted the Ark of the Covenant to the Philistines. They had treated the Ark of the Covenant, God's promise to them, as some kind of idol to show off to others. In return for their arrogance, God made Israel suffer a defeat against the Philistines. The Philistines then took the Ark of the Covenant and brought it into their idol god called Dagon. The next day, the Philistines found their idol on the face of the ground before the Ark of the Covenant. The Philistines then returned the Ark of the Covenant to the Israelites. And this was what Hannah talked about when it came to the grace of God. God opposes those who are proud, even if they were Israelites. Israel was without a king at that time, and many Israelites had caused all kinds of chaos across the Promised Land. So when we head into chapters 7 and 8 of 1 Samuel, by this time, the people longed for a king to rule them. Not a prophet who spoke to God and remind people of moral laws. Not a set of judges that would have different ideas of what pleased God in battle, but a king that would honor the commandments and win the battles like the other nations. So sad Samuel prayed to God, and God said, "This is not you they have rejected. they have rejected me. Let them have a king, but warn them of the bad things that will happen. So Samuel became the last judge to their people. And his last act as a judge was not to make more battles, but to appoint Israel's new king, which turned out to be two. The first man was named Saul. Saul had great qualities to become a king. He was tall, he was pleasant in looks, and he was a warrior also. Samuel would speak at the words of God and remind them not to worship idols, and Saul would safely obey to guide the people to battle as he had with the Ammonites. But similar to the other judges before, Saul had flaws. Well, we all have flaws, right? But the most destructive of this was Saul's pride. Things that Samuel's mother Hannah had sung about and that God was opposed to. So in chapters 13 through 15, Saul and Samuel argue about how Saul disobeyed God. Saul had a habit to collect things from the fallen enemies in battle, even when Samuel spoke that they must destroy these spoils. So Samuel later on warned Saul that his kingdom would not last. We see signs of this warning in these chapters, like when Saul's son, Jonathan, rushed to a Philistine camp and almost got killed. It had become clear that Saul was not the king to rule Israel. So in chapters 16, God spoke that Samuel anoints a new king to replace Saul after Saul would die. This replacement turned out to be the son of Jesse, David, a young shepherd. So though David was also pleasant to the eye, like Saul, he had what Saul hadn't. He had what Saul didn't have. That was humility and strong faith in God. David was also quite fond of music, whereas Saul was fond of conquest and riches. And David's music is something that is mentioned in later on in Psalm, which indicates David's trust and celebration of God and his grace through the Psalms. So Saul feared Goliath, whereas David had faith that God would guide him. It was with this faith and humility in God that David later on defeated with a slingshot the giant of the Philistine champion, Goliath. And we all pretty much know that story. So God had even called David a man after his own heart. So then we hop on over into chapters 18 through 20. And by this time, David wins some favor and was appointed by Saul as a general in his army, especially after the victory against Goliath. But this also begins Saul and Saul's problems with each other. We see that David had become a favorite among the people, and Samuel favored David as the next king. So even Jonathan, Saul's son, became best friends. Of course, this enraged Saul, who hated jealousy for the favored one. And then we're going to hop into chapters 21 to 23, and this is where Saul's anger for David, the shepherd, and his men ran away from him. And so a chase began with them had begun. And so in the wilderness and outside of it. So there were many times that David was able to effectively kill Saul, but he chose not to. And then in chapters 24, David chose to spare Saul's life at a cave in En Gedi, even though he had the upper ground. He still chose not to. So in chapters 25 to 26, David was able to find Saul asleep in his camp and chose to spare his life again. By this time, the prophet Samuel had already died in Israel, and the death of Samuel also offers a chance to test both Saul and David. In chapters 27 to 28, for example, David befriends the head of the Philistines and even chased down the Amalekites. The Amalekites were a group of people that kidnapped David and his wife Abigail and the rest of the family. So Saul, on the other hand, and we get into chapters 27 and 28, with paranoia, even asked a fortune teller to bring back Samuel so he could ask for his advice in a battle against the Philistines. Then we head into chapter 31. Here's Saul and his 3 sons, who would later get killed by the Philistines in battle. David, his trust in God, puts back the message of Hannah's song and Samuel's guidance, that though it is evil in the world of man, there's a faith in God to also bring about a king to redeem man. The question is David that king after the failure of Saul to fulfill that role? So in our reflection today, it's true, of course, David is humble, he's faithful, and he trusts God to guide him and the people of Israel to redemption and salvation. All this is good in David that people respected him, and God doesn't oppose to it. It's that good, humble faith that David was able to sing and celebrate with music. And who doesn't love good music? But why didn't he need to wear armor against Goliath? Later on, we'll see where David takes these gifts in 2 Samuel. It's easy, though, to say that David is a good model and Saul is a bad model, but I think it's also important to reflect what happened to Saul. Many who study the Bible say that Saul was full of great things in him. And of course, he was also full of not so great things in him too. And many also point out that Saul, especially in the later parts of his life, had grown insane. So people say that pride comes before the fall. That is what happened to Saul. That's a pretty good story. Saul seemed to have been a lost soul in the story. But that doesn't mean other people have to be lost. When Saul carried in himself something we carry in most of our own lives, the pride we have of who we think we are or who others think we are, the anger and envy at other people's success or other people in general, and the grief that we can't control our pride and anger when we should, and we ought to. It is a slippery slope, and it can happen to the smartest, the bravest, and the strongest. These slippery slopes even affect people with so much to fight for, like those who fight for their people and their rights. Even Martin Luther King Jr. saw this problem in protests and warned his fellow protesters that hate is too great a burden to bear. And these heavy burdens in ourselves are what causes us to sin, to miss the miraculous gift of life that we receive from God. So in these times, we are reminded of Jesus Christ to have faith. Have faith still, even if you're not someone like David. And after all, when Jesus' Saul was found, he eventually became Paul, one of Jesus's apostles. And though it wasn't the Saul of this story, it's nice to think it was in spirit. That despite all the bad one can make and the bad people can make, there is redemption. That we can love and love others just as Jesus Christ loves us all. So with that, we carry our cross, and not to let it slip any more than we have to sin no more. I hope that you found value in this episode of 1 Samuel, and that you'll come back here next Wednesday when we drop the next episode of 2 Samuel, and you can see what this story continues and grows into be. So don't forget to subscribe to my channel and hit my bell so that you can get the notifications to your inbox when the episode drops, which is usually very early in the morning on Wednesday. So you can watch it when you get up and be refreshed for the day. And please invite your friends to the channel to watch this. All right. And don't forget to visit us on the website where I have my brand new podcast show coming up. I have redone the website and it's beautiful, and so many things where you can put your testimony, you can be a guest on our podcast. Anything you can think of, we have got so many goodies, about 15 freebies on there for you. So go visit us on the web at www.youministries.com. And if you want to study the Bible with us, make sure to head over to our private Facebook group, Girl Read Your Bible, and that's where we study the Bible together and review right here on YouTube with you. So I will see you back next Wednesday for the next episode of 2 Samuel. This is Tammy Becker, founder of You Ministries. See you next time. God bless you.